I think challenge number 1, 2, 3, and 4 right now is to get everyone globally and in the region vaccinated, to have them vaccinated as safely as possible and as quickly as possible. This entire crisis, from its onset over a year ago, has been, a zero-sum game. You might actually call it a negative-sum game because the situation keeps getting worse between, trading off between lives and livelihoods. And vaccines are our only path out of this. And so this is the single greatest, most important, most urgent priority. We recently approved a $9 billion vaccine financing facility at ADB that would make us the largest vaccine financier in the region. There is no higher priority than that. But the nature of this crisis is such that it is not, I think, sufficient to focus only on that problem. And even as we mobilize, supply chains, logistics, people to deliver vaccines, governments across the region have to invest in a recovery, one that's equitable, that we ensure is, as you put it earlier today, not K-shaped, and one that everybody shares in, one that's sustainable, because we know from this crisis that these tail risks do happen. And we have to be ready for the next one. And one very large one is climate change. We have to invest in a recovery that's dynamic because it has to be forward-looking, it has to be focused on the industries of tomorrow and not of those from yesterday. And we have to focus on one that's resilient because if there's one thing this crisis has told us, it is that there's a lot of fragility in our economic arrangements. And so I think that's an extraordinarily tall order. And all of that has to be done against a backdrop of governments that are stretched. They're stretched in terms of their capacity, but they're also stretched in terms of their fiscal space. And so I think that the challenges that the region confronts, that the world confronts today, are truly of a scale that's daunting in many ways, and that is going to take many, many hands at the till to drive us forward.
I think, like all the other countries in the region and globally, we have been really badly impacted by COVID as well. There are a few fronts in terms of what we've been doing. The most immediate, of course, was the healthcare front. We've been very fortunate in the sense that because of the lessons learned from SARS, we had quite a number of measures already in place in terms of social distancing, all the medical and healthcare measures. So fortunate that the number of deaths we've just crossed 30. The others, healthcare system has not been overwhelmed, and we've managed to contain transmission in the country. So for that, we're very fortunate and thankful because it has enabled us to do other things. The vaccination program is underway. We're targeting to be able to vaccinate everyone who's staying here on a long-term basis by the end of the third quarter. We've been rolling it out and it's on track. So that's as far as the healthcare part is concerned. And we've just finished our parliament budget and approved a raise in the salaries of our healthcare workers because they really have been the heroes at the front line. Then on the economic part and the societal part, I would say there are two stages. The first part, and that was really last year, was when, the country was in ICU, critical care. And for the critical care part, the most important thing was making sure that jobs were preserved. So we had what we call a job support scheme, where government paid a certain percentage of salaries to make sure that people did not lose their jobs, or at least you saved as many jobs as you could. Then for those who did lose their jobs, there were various schemes to help support them whilst we helped them to find new jobs. Those came in the form of, relief grants or for those who were self-employed. There were separate schemes for that. Then on the societal side, making sure that we pumped out household support and support for families. And in addition to that, of course, for companies, it was a matter of keeping their heads above water with temporary bridging loan programs, moratoriums on being able to pull the plug in terms of legal actions, etc. So I call that really the ICU phase. The next phase is the recovery phase. And if, like me, you're of a certain age, many of you will remember the TV program, The $6 Million Man, Lee Majors, Bionic Man. Do you remember the opening narration? Okay, great. I see everybody's of a certain age. So you remember the opening part where it says, gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability. Better than he was before, better, stronger, faster. I think we're exactly at that stage. We do have the technology. We do have the capability. And we are trying to position ourselves to come out of that stronger. And so the key programs for that would be helping businesses to transform, to innovate, and then paying attention to workers, helping them to reskill. And then for the lower income workers and those not so well educated, making sure that you're able to do income supplements as well as help them to acquire the skills that they will need. So that's a broad picture.
We have seen firsthand how consumer behavior and preferences have changed because of COVID. We've seen how driver behavior changes, how restaurant behavior has changes, and we've had to adapt very accordingly. I think probably three key areas that we think about. First is hygiene safety. That's P0. It's a key differentiator for the entire industry. It wasn't so a year or 2 years ago. And our job is to demonstrate that our trips are safe, our drivers are healthy, our cars are regularly disinfected, and our policies enforce a very consistent and high bar while keeping pricing affordable. And I think this is what consumers and customers will demand for in a post-COVID world when we're recovering. You know, we use AI now to ensure that driver and delivery partners are wearing their masks before they accept rides or make deliveries. And it's a huge amount of work, but we're committed to providing the safest, the cleanest, and the most reliable mode of transportation and delivery, full stop. The second, on the consumer side, there's no question that behavior has changed, and deliveries and cashless payments are here to stay. Our customers are shopping differently. And what's very encouraging in the data that we see is even when cities open up, our customers continue to use delivery because of the convenience. And this seems to be a very durable change in behavior. And so you see this effect happening in many different ways. In September, we announced our digital pasar, or wet market service in Malaysia. So even if you're in a smaller city like Kota Kinabalu, you can now buy groceries online from your favorite wet market. It's lower cost, it's more fresh. And over time, we're going to digitize as many pasars across the region as we can. And then to the last point, then, I think we're very focused on growing cashless payments and financial services. It's just a much safer and more reliable alternative to handling cash. And we're doing a lot there, whether it's our micro investment products or insurance products, really to provide a digital alternative to what's historically been a very different industry here.
It's really interesting. I think when the pandemic first hit and the stay-at-home orders came, a lot of people initially said, oh, this means that sustainability is sort of yesterday's news and on the back burner until we kind of figure this out. But it only took a few weeks before people realized that actually the pandemic was very much part of a sustainability issue in terms of the broader nexus of thinking about how do labor issues, exactly as Ming was saying, really fit into a sustainable business? How do health issues, determine in a material way whether we can actually have business continuity? And climate change, if you think about that, is really kind of the macro mega trend that encompasses all of these things, right? We've seen an incredible interplay and a convergence of climate risk, health risks, and also social justice risks, right? I mean, if you look at, just on a few things, one is when you think about climate risk and what that means for us as a global community, as you have increasing population, a warming planet, and more people living in more density and proximity to nature, you end up having what is an incredibly hospitable global environment for infectious diseases to spread. Morgan Stanley research estimates that under a business as usual climate change scenario, we're going to have an additional 1 billion people around the world exposed to infectious diseases like malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, et cetera, that they've never previously been exposed to. So predominantly actually in Europe and North America, suddenly these tropical infectious diseases will become prevalent. If we actually were to align to Paris and limit the temperature rises, we would then be able to limit it to only an additional 500 million people exposed to these diseases, right? So, I think it's just one simple issue where you realize that climate change does have this massive global spillover effect. But when you look at how COVID has actually landed in the US as well as globally, I think, unfortunately, it's this incredibly stark picture of the interrelationship between climate change, healthcare, and poverty and racial injustice. Right in the U.S. alone, it's unfortunately now it's all too well known that the communities the hardest hit by COVID have been predominantly lower income communities of color. They happen to be in the jobs that have the most exposure to risk factors. They also happen to have, the least good access to a lot of the technology that the minister referenced in terms of the better filtration, the better protections. But even more, when you then compound that with climate change, we've seen there have been studies that show that low income neighborhoods in the U.S., even in the same meteorological range as a high income area, so basically neighbors, the poor communities in summer can actually be 5 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, simply because they don't have access to trees, to parks, to water elements. That higher temperature leads to more stress and a health-related perspective, and also to more respiratory disease, which then makes you more vulnerable to a disease like COVID. And so you have this incredible compounding of impacts. So for all of this, what it means is that what we've seen is actually that financial markets and investors have started to realize that climate change is frankly this incredible proxy for environmental, social, and governance risk. And if you were, it's incredible how the conversation has really pivoted among both investors and corporate leaders to say, it's not about, are we going to be magnanimous and think about climate change because it's the right thing to do from a moral or a social perspective. It is frankly irresponsible business practices and irresponsible investment practices today to not think about climate risk as a fundamental part of your business continuity. And frankly, we've seen the returns, right? That companies who are forward thinking about climate as well as social issues actually do better. They have lower volatility in their returns and higher volatility and ultimately higher stock prices. So we're really seeing all these things come together. Anytime you have sort of a big surge of interest, you can get a frothy market where people sort of, rush to label themselves whatever the cool trend of the moment is. With respect to climate, I think that we have a couple of things. One is that, frankly, the investor community has gotten extremely savvy about this and is already quite focused on really understanding, don't just say you've got a green fund or a green investment. We actually want to see transparency around the carbon disclosure and around a whole variety of sustainability metrics. I've been serving on the board for the past number of years on the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB, which is focused really on how do we have industry by industry relevant disclosures around sustainability issues that could actually affect that business. So that, I think what we need right now, frankly, globally, is an increased harmonization from the regulators, from central banks, from investors around what are the critical environmental, social, and governance things that must be disclosed, and how do we have a normative system so that we don't have a situation, as you said, that your sustainability report is really pretty and, and maybe it's prettier than mine, that doesn't mean anything. There should actually be key performance indicators that are uniform for the chemical industry, where you can then say chemical company A versus chemical company C is performing better or worse. Auto company A versus auto company B is performing better or worse. And only once you start having a real system of disclosure and commitment. So, that's one of the reasons why we've been very excited. We were the first US bank to join what's called a Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, so that you could actually have a uniform system around how do we account for carbon emissions, and then that helps make it meaningful when you then have commitments. And again, Morgan Stanley committed last fall to align our business with the goals of Paris. And so we're really going to be adopting a uniform system around transparency and disclosure of how our business and the businesses whom we work with contribute to climate change or to climate solutions. So we've got to have transparency, uniform metrics, and really global coordination around that.
Just a couple of things to say. The first thing I would say is that I think there was an important point in what Audrey just said, which is that for the markets, the optimal path is the path of climate resiliency and adaptation, and that's consistent with long-term profits. And I think in the same way, the fiscally most sustainable path is also the one that's consistent with appropriate investments to address these risks. And so while the cost is high, this is actually, from a budget perspective, making the right investments, is both the right and the smart thing to do. Now, how do governments, generate the funds and the support they need? Maybe I'll just talk about two things. The first is just fiscal capacity. We're coming towards, we hope, the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, although it will be with us for some time. Already, governments in Southeast Asia have spent $420 billion just fighting this pandemic alone. These are countries that, by and large, already were operating sort of below the 15% tax to GDP target that's usually identified as being appropriate for sustainable development. And so one thing that we need to do in order to be able to finance these expenditures is enhance the domestic resource mobilization capacity of governments. And also remember, tax bases have been crumbling over the last 12 months as revenues have deteriorated as the pace of economic activity has slowed down. And this is an area where ADB is going to be active. We've just set up a new regional hub for domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. And so just getting better at efficiently collecting tax, designing programs that are also more progressive, incorporating things like a carbon tax. So I think one thing that's absolutely, a key part of this process of generating the funds is ensuring that governments, have the ability to deploy the capital. And I think that that's something that's going to be very important. Now, the second piece is going to be mobilizing, other sources of support, in this case, particularly capital. We've talked a lot and for many years about public-private partnerships. We've talked a lot about mobilizing private capital. There's still an enormous gap. ADB has projected there's a $1.7 trillion infrastructure need in Asia every year. Only half of that is being financed. We do $20 billion on average in a year. The majority of that in infrastructure. It's not nearly enough. And so I think organizations like ours have really got to enhance our collaborative process with other actors, working with governments, working with the private sector, leveraging the intangible assets of our platforms, the trust we have, the convening authority we have, the technical knowledge we have in project preparation, investing in the standardization of these processes. And so I think the first piece I would say is expanding fiscal capacity. The second piece is mobilizing private capital, which is a difficult problem, but one that I think there's a lot of people now focused on, and we should be able to make good progress on in the years ahead.
It's a big challenge. We were very fortunate at the beginning of last year when we went into the fiscal year that we had current surpluses. So essentially, in addition to all the current revenues, we had a fair amount of current surpluses, I think nearly 10 billion or so. But that got deployed and used up in the course of fighting COVID last year. Then we also deployed our reserves because as a matter of fiscal prudence, part of our policy is to make sure that we have reserves and that we invest our reserves and we grow the reserves. So looking ahead this year, our budget was just completed in Parliament. In addition to current revenues, we'll have had to dip a little bit more into our reserves. So last year we deployed 52 billion from our reserves. I think we'll be taking an additional 1.5 billion this year. But we're also looking at borrowing against or to fund nationally significant infrastructure. And at the same time, we have signaled that goods and services tax would have to be increased. Now, this was something that was on the cards even before COVID. This was something because we have an aging population, healthcare needs recurrent healthcare needs will be there. So it was something that was on the cards before then, but that will be an added revenue stream. We haven't precluded other measures, but we're studying those. We signaled that we will review carbon tax. So, there may well be an increase there. But I think the key thing is really to focus on growth. Because growth is what brings the revenue. That augments your corporate income tax, your personal income tax, and it just gets the whole economy going. So we've got to pay a lot of attention to that. And the digital economy will be a big part of this as well.
If I could just follow up on Ahmed's point about public-private partnerships, I think those can actually be very, very powerful. In Malaysia, for example, we're the only non-government linked digital wallet that the government is now using to directly distribute government relief funds for COVID, because it's much more efficient. There's much less loss in the system, so it's much lower cost. In Thailand, we're working with the Ministry of Agriculture to help Thai farmers sell their produce online, help them become more sustainable and earn incomes. In Indonesia, we've set up drive-through COVID vaccine centers. So you can just take your car, drive through it. I think last weekend we vaccinated over 5,000 people. So I think a lot of these private partnerships can be very, very helpful.
In the case of water, Singapore is very small, and water has always been a scarce commodity. So from the time of independence, it is something that we have always seen as precious and something that needs to be conserved. And we had to search and look for ways to make sure that we were sustainable in water. We started off by having reservoirs, but effectively, we also had legislation that allows the state to sequester every drop of rainfall that comes through your pipes and goes into the drains. In the early years, we didn't have the technology. What happened was when it goes into the storm canals and so on, it flows out into the sea. But about 10 years back, we built the Marina Barrage. Those of you who have been here in Singapore may be familiar with it. Effectively, it is a barrage across the mouth of the Singapore River, and it acts as a water catchment. What it does is effectively turns the entire island into a reservoir, because it means that all the water is captured and it allows you to recycle the water. We've also explored and are we're doing desalination, but more importantly, new water, which works on the process of osmosis. It's filter after filter after filter, where you filter out all the bad elements, and you basically get pure distilled water, which is drinkable. In fact, it is so pure that it has no taste. So they actually have to add back minerals to it. We use it largely for industrial purposes, but you can use new water for drinking as well. And when it first came out, all of us in government had to drink it to prove that it was safe and to show that it was fine. So I think the key thing is the investment into sustainability, identification of the key areas and industries in which you need to have sustainable solutions, to have the legislation, and importantly, the enforcement of the legislation, and to create the conditions for the investment to come in to promote those kinds of solutions.
I was just going to pick up on, as the minister was saying, about the very encouraging, I think, swell of interest from private investors, who are interested in sustainable investing and how they can align their investments with the SDGs. right? I think that we've definitely seen the SDGs, and in particular, actually, the water, protection increasing protection of the oceans as a very significant theme. We actually have been focusing a lot on the reduction of plastic waste getting into our rivers, oceans, and landfills. And when we introduced a new product last year, focused specifically on enabling investors to say, I want my investments to actually specifically go towards plastic waste reduction, especially in the oceans, that was one of our fastest growing new products that we've introduced in the past many years. It's now a $30 trillion market of investors seeking to align with some sort of sustainability goals. And what we've seen is that more and more and more investors are more sophisticated, are increasingly interested in focusing on individual SDGs. And we're really seeing an ability to align capital markets instruments with that. With COVID specifically, we've seen the capital markets really respond with incredible demand and depth of demand to bonds that we've done around COVID response. Whether that be for some of the vaccine makers, each more than $1 billion raised, or philanthropic institutions actually tapping the capital markets to funnel money there. So I think just as the minister said, I think there's a really interesting set of momentum around private sector dollars coming through the capital markets, specifically towards SDGs.
We take very, very seriously, our obligation both as stewards of shareholder capital, which is tax money, and so the money of the people of the various countries that comprise the ADB, but also our role as a development finance institution. And so we have in place, a number of mechanisms, whether it relates to ensuring that there isn't corruption and anti-corruption policies, but also in terms of ensuring that there's impact. So we have very active monitoring. In the case of our COVID response fiscal support facilities, we created collaborative frameworks where on a quarterly basis, we sit with the government and we review everything we're doing. I just did that with the government of the Philippines yesterday, our second quarterly review of our work together on COVID. If we take, for example, something like our recent $400 million loan to the Philippines, one of the conditions of the loan was that the government have in place a fair and comprehensive strategy for vaccine allocation. And we work closely with the government on developing this. They've put in place a plan that closely follows WHO guidelines and prioritizes healthcare workers, essential staff, the marginalized, as well as those with comorbidities and risk of illness. In parallel with that loan, we provided an additional $2 million to the Department of Health so that they can develop a monitoring plan and so that they can ensure that there is trustworthy information available for the entire population. So we invest quite a bit of energy, effort, and capital and resource in ensuring that the lending we do is really for maximum development impact. It's an unbelievably important priority for the organization. Well, I think that's a subset of the question of the role of FDI and of foreign actors, and I think the key point I would make there is that we need to ensure that governments have the appropriate capacity they need, and institutional capacity they need to manage FDI, and in particular when it comes in lending form. So, for example, countries need to have robust debt management offices. They have the capacity to understand the liabilities. These can be both direct, but I think more importantly, sometimes contingent liabilities that exist at the level of SOEs or subsidiaries. So ensuring that a sovereign is able to aggregate that picture so that it knows on the liability side of the balance sheet, what its obligations are, I think is important. And that's an area where we and others have been engaged. And that's really agnostic as to source, right? And then the second thing is that you want to make sure that where you're spending that money, it's well spent. So there's one element of that is the sorts of questions you're asking me about ADB's own programs, right? How do you make sure it's not corrupt? How do you make sure procurement is done well? But then there's also a set of questions about, do you ensure, how are you comfortable that it's high quality? And high quality also includes things like sustainability, right? Is the infrastructure you're building consistent with the world as we expect it to be? And so, I think that, I think these are really not country-specific questions. They're really questions about capacity, standards, and raising the game. And I think the lesson, if any, across the world is that, FDI can play a very important role in driving development and driving growth, which ultimately, as Minister Rajah noted, is the thing we need to enable all of these outcomes. But we want countries to be able to engage in a meaningful and intelligent and knowledgeable way, and to direct those investments into places where they'll make the most long-term benefit.
Thankfully, our logo is already green, so we're already halfway there. There is a saying that standing still is the fastest way of moving backwards. That really resonates with me. And I think this does all go down to innovation in serving our customers in the best way possible. Let me sort of explain what I mean. So food delivery continues to be very, very critical, but our customers want more than that. They want the ability to order packaged food. So we launched a delivery business to deliver food from local convenience stores or the corner shop. Other consumers wanted to buy fresh groceries online. So we digitized wet markets and grocery stores. And very soon what you'll see is there will be tremendous demand for farm to table. And once you start digitizing that entire supply chain, what you're really doing is you're shortening the supply chain from farm to table. You're cutting out a lot of waste that occurs from the multiple layers of logistics and distribution that happens from the farm to your plate. And I think every time we digitize another part of the chain in the supply chain, then we end up with a greener world in Southeast Asia.